Wittgenstein bestrides 20th century philosophy in much the way that Picasso bestrides 20th century art. That is, he dominates the period roughly from 1925 until 1975, and his influence, of course, comes in two waves. One is the impact of the Tractatus, which is his first great masterpiece, published in 1921, which affected philosophy in Cambridge and in lesser degree in London, not in Oxford, and above all in Vienna, where it was the inspiration for the Vienna Circle, which is a group of, on the whole, radical philosophers, very much opposed to traditional forms of philosophy and to the, broadly speaking, Germanic tradition. Most of them scientists or mathematicians. The impact of the Vienna Circle spread all over Europe, and with the rise of Nazism, most of the members of the Circle fled to the United States, and they transformed philosophy in the United States. And Wittgenstein's Tractatus was one of the main inspirations of the Vienna Circle. And the second wave of influence came with his posthumous publication of his masterwork, which is the Philosophical Investigations, was published in 1953, which overturned not quite everything, but at least a great deal of what he thought in the Tractatus. That is, so he produced two diametrically opposed philosophies, and the Investigations was the major impact, had the major impact on Western philosophy, roughly between 1953, when it was published, and 1975. So, the influence was colossal. Today his influence has sunk, and very markedly so. Surprisingly, it's not sunk in the way that people gradually slip into the shadow, so to speak, and they're no longer an issue to be discussed. That happens to most philosophers, and including great ones. There's a tremendous animus towards Wittgenstein. That is, an awful lot of philosophers not only don't want him to be read, but actually hate his work. And that's peculiar and very strange. There are perhaps a variety of reasons for it. One reason is that everything he said runs against what you might call the spirit of the age. We're increasingly a culture obsessed with science. And that's true both here and even more so in the United States of America. And obsessed as we are with science, we are inclined to think that if there's any serious problem, then there's a scientific answer to it. And if there isn't a scientific answer to it, then it's not a serious problem in the first place. And there's a tendency to think that. And today, of course, the most visible form which you find that trend of thought is neuroscience, cognitive neuroscience. I mean, you can't turn on the radio or television without hearing more and more patter about your brain does this, and your brain does that, and your brain tells you this, and your brain tells you that. Now, Wittgenstein would have thought that was a profoundly Philistine, blind and foolish Weltanschauung, way of looking at things. He hated scientism, and scientism, or by scientism, is to be understood the extension of the methods and patterns of reasoning of science to domains in which science is incompetent to comment. So, just to give an example, neuroscientists, including famously Ramachandran, who gave the Reith lectures some 10 years or so ago, trying to explain the nature of our aesthetic responses by reference to an imprinted disposition to react to the hourglass shape of a female form, and this is the root of our aesthetic sensibility. Unfortunately, that won't distinguish between the pin-up girl in Playboy magazine and a Titian nude. The one is not an object of aesthetic appreciation. So, one feature of scientism and is the thought that all forms of explanation are are scientific. There are no forms of explanation and no problems to be explained which aren't to be explained in the pattern of scientific explanation, whereas Wittgenstein was a pluralist in explanatory theory, accounts of the nature of explanation. Another feature would be the general exclusion of teleology or purposive explanation, and that's particularly marked, of course, in biology, where there's a very deleterious tendency among biologists to think that what Darwin, with his theory of evolution, was able to do was to exclude teleology from biology. Now that's that's a misinterpretation of Darwin. What Darwin did was to break the connection between purposiveness and design. Now, you can't understand biology without reference to purpose. You can't understand an organism without understanding that the heart has this and this function and the kidneys have that and that function. That's their purpose. That's what they exist for. And you may grasp that without yet grasping how it's affected. That is, you may come to realize that the heart is a pump and it's responsible for the circulation of the blood without knowing how the heart does it. So purpose is one thing, and the understanding of the mechanism by which the purpose is pursued is another. But you can ascribe purpose to things without ascribing design to them. Nobody designed our kidneys, but they have a purpose. So here, whereas most modern biologists are reductionists in this respect, that is, they want to reduce teleological explanation to causal explanation, Wittgenstein was not a reductionist in this respect or in any other. A further final point, and I'll stop on this point, this issue. The final point would be, I think people do sense inchoately that if what Wittgenstein is obscurely saying is a tremendous threat to the way that they're doing philosophy. That is, if Wittgenstein's right, then the way they're doing philosophy has got to be wrong. And since they're very confident that what they're doing is right, Wittgenstein's got to be wrong. But the animus towards Wittgenstein, I think, is partly motivated because he is seen as a rather inchoate threat, which indeed he is, although most of the people who take this stance have very little understanding of what he said. So I want to say a few words now about his life, because it's a very peculiar, very interesting life. It's an interesting feature that the name Wittgenstein is known to a hugely wide cultural audience, people who couldn't understand what he has to say to save their lives, so to speak. Why should they? It's highly arcane recherché material. And yet they've heard of Wittgenstein, and poems have been written for Wittgenstein, about Wittgenstein. There's an oratorio for Wittgenstein. Eduardo Paolozzi has a series of prints of Wittgenstein in New York. Auden quotes Wittgenstein all over the place. How has this come about? He was referred to once in a television program about him as the thinking man's hero. How come? After all, he was a retiring man who lived a very solitary life, who didn't have any great adventures anywhere. How come he's become a culture, so to speak, an intellectual icon? And I think there is an answer to that, I believe. I think that from time to time in our culture, a figure is thrown up who is perceived as living through in his own tortured and personal life the cross-currents, the tensions, the contradictions in the culture of the day. And you might say something of this in the case of Byron. After all, Byron was something of a rake and a very distinguished English poet, but why should Goethe embed Byron in the second part of Faust? Why should Byron be a hero all over Europe? Why should people have been in enormous distress when they heard of Byron's death? Well, somehow or other they felt that Byron, in the tortured and tormented life that he did indeed live, was living through the tensions, the contradictions, the stresses and strains of the culture of his day. And I suspect that something rather like that is the case in Wittgenstein. Now, he was born in 1889 to one of the wealthiest families in Austria. His father was a completely self-made man, and was effectively the Austrian Carnegie. He started from absolutely nothing, and by the time he was 40 or 1945 he was the owner of effectively of the Austrian steel industry. So enormous wealth in the family. They were of Jewish descent, that is, 3 of the grandparents were converted Jews. They converted to Catholicism in the 1830s or 1840s. He was, to the extent that he had any religious background, he was brought up as a Catholic, although he lost his faith in his teens at school. I'll say a little bit more about that. There were 8 children. He was the youngest. There were 5 brothers and 3 sisters. The father, who obviously must have been a gigantic, towering figure of immense charisma, was busy about his own affairs. He had resigned, he had sold out his business when he was in his 50s, but busied himself writing articles about economics. He was a great patron of the art. Those of you who remember Vienna, the Secession building was built with Karl Wittgenstein's money, and he supported many artists. And the house was the great musical salon of Vienna. I mean, Mahler visited, Brahms played many of his pieces in the house, and very often the first performances. Bruno Walzer was a friend of the family. Joseph Joachim was a slightly remote cousin. And it was a major musical center, musical salon, and all the family were highly musical. 2 of the 2 elder brothers may indeed have had a touch of genius in their musical abilities. The father wanted them to become giants of industry like himself, forced them to study things they didn't want to study, and unfortunately both committed suicide at successive stages. So 2 suicides of elder brothers was pretty hard going, and things went from there, it went even worse, because a 3rd brother, who was the most settled and stable of them, of all of them, they were very highly strung. The 3rd brother committed suicide in 1918. He was an officer in the Austrian army, and when the Austrian front in Italy collapsed, his men refused to carry on fighting, and he shot himself out of shame that they were surrendering. So Wittgenstein lost 3 of his brothers through suicide. The mother was completely obsessed with the father, and the children were more or less brought up by nannies and tutors. Very little attention from the parents, and Wittgenstein was pretty much brought up by nannies, tutors, and one of the elder sisters. He was educated at home till the age of 16, went to school at Linz, not to a gymnasium, but to a technische Hochschule. Sorry, to a technical school, to a technical school. And at the age of 18, decided he would more or less follow his father's designs and study engineering. And he went to the Technische Hochschule in Berlin-Charlottenburg to study engineering. He got a diploma in engineering after 2 years there. While he was there, he got interested in what went by the name of aeronautics, that is the early design of aeroplanes, and learnt that the major research centre for the subject was in Manchester, and came to England to study aeronautical engineering at Manchester. While he was there, incidentally, he designed a jet propulsion propeller, which was indeed patented, and was for a brief while used, but it was not very effective. But his interest in the subject was deep. While he was designing this complicated propeller, he got interested in problems in mathematics, and problems in mathematics led him into philosophy of mathematics. He got in touch with the great German logician Gottlob Frege in Jena, and Frege told him to study with Bertrand Russell in Cambridge. So he went to Cambridge, and Russell later on told that this eccentric young Austrian turned up and went to him, and at the end of the term and said, "Professor Russell, I want you to tell me whether I can become a philosopher or if I'm a complete fool, I'll be an aeronaut, an aeronautical engineer. And Russell said, well, go away and write something over the vacation. So Wittgenstein comes back at the beginning of next vacation, having written, Russell said, I just read the first 3 sentences. I said, no, you don't. You become a philosopher, don't become an aeronautical engineer. So Russell's story goes. He studied with Russell, and he had very little philosophical background, very little indeed. He studied with Russell. Within 6 months, he was arguing with Russell as an equal, and within a year, he was running circles around Russell. Quite amazing. A tremendous flowering of his intellectual powers coincided, interestingly, with the earlier death of his father. And it seems that it was only when he got out of his father's shadow, his father died, that he flowered himself. Russell describes him as being the quintessential genius. I mean, the passion, the intellectual intensity, the dedication, the obsession. In 1912-13, he went on a holiday to Norway, decided that he could work much better if he was in total solitude, and decided to remove himself from Cambridge and to work alone in Norway. He went back to visit his family in 1914. War broke out and he immediately volunteered. He served in the Austrian army for 4 years. He had the idea, very romantic idea, and I suspect misguided, that you only find out who you really are and what you're really worth when you face death. So while all sane people were doing their best not to get killed, he was doing his best to face the worst fire. And he was awarded various decorations and medals for valor and so on. During this period, he carried on, whenever he has had vacation, and sometimes even in the trenches, carried on working on his first book. And he finished that, the Tractatus, in 1919. When the Austrian army collapsed, he was taken prisoner. He was in prisoner of war camp for the best part of a year in Cassino. And as soon as he got out from prisoner of war camp, he attempted to get the book published. It was duly published through the good works of Russell. He had great difficulty publishing it. Austria was fallen apart, and it is, after all, an extremely obscure and difficult book. He thought that he'd undergone his suffering during the war was obviously very great. He came back a changed person, no longer the wealthy young man about town, extremely good-looking, dressed extremely well, and so on. And the first thing he did was to get rid of his fortune, and he was one of the wealthiest young men in Europe, and he unloaded his money on his family, on his brothers and sisters. He didn't give it away to charity. He just didn't want to have any money, because he thought that having money would corrupt him and corrupt his relationships to others. And thinking that he'd solved all the major problems of philosophy in the Tractatus, he decided to become a primary school teacher, and which he did, and taught in peasant villages in Upper Austria between 1921 and 1927. Not a happy time for him at all. He gave that up in 1927, went back to Vienna, and his sister Margrethe, who of course was hugely wealthy, was building a mansion for herself, and she'd hired an acquaintance, a friend of Wittgenstein, Paul Engelmann, to build it for her. And Wittgenstein was in a deep, deep depression, and they tried to revive him and to get him interested in something by drawing him into the project, which in the end of the day he actually took over and completed the building of a very striking mansion, rather Bauhaus in style, which still stands today. You can see it in Vienna. It's well worth visiting. It is exceedingly interesting. He was very uncertain what to do and decided in 1929 he'd see whether he could do philosophy again, and went to Cambridge and then there was a sudden outbreak, an outpouring of creativity, which lasted for about half a dozen years, in which he undermined almost everything that he'd said before. As he realized there were fatal flaws in the Tractatus, and he proceeded to pick it apart. Now, there's an interesting phenomenon going on here, and I don't know if any of you have read Isaiah Berlin's book, The Hedgehog and the Fox. Some of you may have done. So Isaiah used a single line from the Greek poet Archilochus, just a fragment, which says that the fox knows many things, but the hedgehog knows one big thing. Now, nobody has a clue what that means, and we never shall, but Isaiah made very good use of it, and he argued, well, there are two kinds of great creative spirits in philosophy and literature. The one, the hedgehog, who has a unbelievably powerful, sharp vision where one basic principle will explain absolutely everything. Everything can be subsumed under the aegis of this single overriding vision. And there you might say, well, and Plato was certainly a hedgehog, and Dante was obviously a hedgehog, and when it came to Tolstoy, Dostoevsky would be a hedgehog. When it came to Tolstoy, as I argued, well, Tolstoy was by nature a fox with an awareness of the multiplicity and diversity and complexity of things, but by conviction a hedgehog. So you have the contrast between his great early work of War and Peace and Anna Karenina, and then the later religious work. So he transforms himself from being a natural fox into a hedgehog. Now, using that Isaiah's analogy, you could say something rather like that of Wittgenstein, except it's the other way around. In writing, the Tractatus is a completely obsessive vision in which one basic principle will explain all the problems of philosophy and of logic and of the nature of representation and nature of logical necessity. It all rests on one basic insight into the nature of the proposition as such. He later on realizes, no, he'd got this all wrong, and what you get in the later philosophy is a vision of enormous complexity, multiplicity, diversity, richness, anything but a homogeneous principle, a huge multiplicity of, perhaps not of principles at all, but of motley. And this is how you have to understand and look at the problems of philosophy. So in Wittgenstein you can say, well, he was by nature a hedgehog, but transformed himself into a fox. And now, what's the point of my telling you all this analogy? He had an understanding of what it is to be in the grip of a philosophical vision, which is totally compelling. He said, things just must be like this, and at any cost you will fit them into the straitjacket, not realizing that that's what you're doing. And his demolition of the various straitjackets or the various tunnel visions human thought is subject to is unparalleled in the history of the subject. And I think you can explain it by reference to the fact that he had undergone for 7 solid years of composing the Tractatus. He knew later on exactly what it is like to be in the grip of a totally compelling vision. And so his critical writings about fundamental principles that grip us like a vice is unsurpassable. Now, I've said his major later work was the Philosophical Investigations. That's the only other finished book. I mean, he only finished 2 books. There are lots and lots of books to be bought, but they're fragments, unfinished work, half-finished work, and so forth. So the main work is the Philosophical Investigations, but in addition to that, he spent about 2/5 of his time between 1929 and his death working on philosophy of mathematics. He worked on it until 1944, where suddenly, abruptly abandons it. But it is interesting that in 1941, when one of his pupils was writing a little entry for a dictionary or an encyclopedia of philosophy, was writing a little entry about Wittgenstein and showed it to him, Wittgenstein added the sentence, his main contribution to philosophy has been in philosophy of mathematics, which is very interesting. In 1944, he laid it aside and never resumed it, although there is a note in his notebooks in 1949 saying, my book on philosophy of mathematics, which belongs together with my philosophical investigations, could have the title Beginning Mathematics. I'll explain that in a moment. So we have reason for thinking that had he lived and had he been able to get his act together, which is more doubtful, he would have completed a major work in philosophy of mathematics. In addition to that, we have 4 late volumes of notes on philosophy of psychology. And that is, again, completely unfinished work, but wonderful, wonderful insights are scattered there. Now, he said, I've said more than once, his work is extraordinarily difficult. The Tractatus is written in the Tractatus is a major contribution to German letters. It's beautiful, but it's beautiful in the way that a book of the Old Testament is beautiful. It is sibylline, marmoreal sentences, as it were, handing down the truth from the mountaintops. The world is everything that is the case. The world consists of facts, not of things, and so on and so forth. It's redolent with technical terminology and logical notation, exceedingly difficult to understand. The later work is written in a homely, home-baked sort of way, very, very informal, little fragments of conversations, little fragments of dialogue. No technicalities whatsoever, no logical notation to speak of. And Wittgenstein said of it, and yet it's very difficult to understand. You can read any sentence, it's perfectly clear. He said, people pick up books written by other philosophers, and they look at it, and they say, my goodness me, this must be terribly deep. I can't understand a word he says, but it's very deep. And then they pick up my book, and they say, I can understand every word he says. What on earth is he talking about? And there's a perfectly good sense in which that's true. He said in the preface, in one of the greatest understatements of the century, so to speak, he said, I wouldn't want to save anybody the trouble of thinking for themselves. Well, you can say that again, because it is a difficult book to read, precisely because you have to work terribly hard to see what he's driving at. When you cotton on, then you start understanding his profundity, and you only see, it's like an iceberg. You see a top 9th or 10th or whatever it is above the water, and you have to infer the huge mass that's underlying it. But he leaves that to the reader to do, which is a very tall order. I won't say any more about the Tractatus, but the Wittgenstein wrote in he wrote in notebooks. He carried around a notebook with him because he often had thoughts while walking, and he'd scribble them out in the most appalling handwriting, obviously on his knee or something. He'd go back home, copy that out into a larger notebook in a slightly better handwriting, and then that would get transferred to yet another notebook, very often changing things as he goes along. And these are observations. There may be 1 sentence, 3 sentences, sometimes a paragraph or 2, rarely more than 2 paragraphs long. When he was satisfied that he'd covered a range of themes that he felt was enough, he would then dictate the whole thing to a typist. So he'd have a clean typescript. Then he'd proceed to cut up the typescript so that each remark was on a separate slip of paper. Then he'd shuffle these around into an order until he got an order which pleased him, and paste them in a book and have that typed out onto a clean typescript, which he then would start scribbling in the margins, making changes here, making changes there, and copy them out, yes. So this went on and on and on. The one thing he couldn't do was clarify his own thoughts himself and sit down with a clean sheet of paper and start writing from the beginning till the end. He could not do that. He was obviously looking for forms of words which would catch the thought, or express the thought with the absolute precision or absolute character that he wanted to catch. And when he found that form of words, you can't touch it again. It's very interesting because you sometimes see in the Nachlass, one sentence will be redrafted 6, 7 times, And when you read it, it doesn't mean anything different. It's just the Satzklang. It's the word, the rhythm. It's almost like somebody composing poetry. So if you work that way, you can shuffle the bits and pieces around till the cows come home. There's no one right way of doing it. So he was never satisfied with the philosophical investigation, and says so in his preface. He says modestly, but not altogether wrong, it's a work of genius, but he said, I would have liked to have written a good book, but alas, the time has passed in which I can do so. Well, by his standards, I think he's right. It's a work of genius, but it is not the work he wanted. I think that is true. Now, I should say one thing for those of you who are interested in reading further. The most accessible of his works is the Blue Book. That's a dictation given to students in Cambridge. He said, I'd like them to take something away in their hands, if not in their heads. And so he gave them a terms dictation, and so for once he's trying to make himself intelligible to an audience. Whereas when he writes for himself, at most he's trying to make himself intelligible to God, but no one else. So those of you who want to read further, the Blue Book is the thing to look at first. It's by far the most accessible of his texts. Okay. Now, when you look at... how am I off for time? I've forgotten when I was supposed to... I've got another 20 minutes. Good. So what was his great achievement in philosophy of the later work? So I would say, well, there are four main great areas where he literally ploughed up European thought de novo, overturned almost everything that had been thought in the subject. He was, in many ways, in the true sense of the word, he was radical. That is, he went down to the roots of things and usually pulled them up. He couldn't walk down a path somebody else had walked down first. He had to walk down his own route. And in four great fields, I think he aimed to effect a complete philosophical revolution, and for a while did, insofar as he was understood, which was not terribly far, but there was some understanding, and he had a great influence. The first is in the domain of philosophy of language, where the fundamental question is, what is the nature of linguistic representation? I mean, what is the function of words? What is the function of sentences? How can sentences represent what they represent? And he, in this... so I'll leave that there for the moment. I'll come back to it in a second. The second was philosophy of mathematics, which I will not talk about, save to say one thing. Mathematicians, at the time he was alive, were divided between logicists who thought that mathematics was basically reducible to logic. You could express the whole of mathematics in purely logical terms. So math was a branch of logic. Intuitionists or constructivists who thought that mathematics was a free creation of the human mind, we construct mathematics, so it's anti-Platonist. The first doctrine is Platonist, and the third one was formalism. They all had in common that they thought that mathematical propositions were truths of a certain kind, and that they described some subject matter. Wittgenstein thought, no, although we talk about mathematical propositions as being true or false, and quite correctly so, mathematical propositions are really rules of representation. They're normative, not descriptive. So 2 + 2 = 4 is effectively a rule for the transformation of other propositions containing numbers. For example, if you have 2 apples in this hand and 2 apples in that hand, you don't have to count them to know that you have 4 apples, because 2 + 2 = 4. If you have 25 bags with 25 marbles in each bag, you don't have to count them up to know that you have 625 marbles, because 25 times 25 is 625. So a mathematical equation is a transformation rule for empirical propositions. That's hugely oversimplified, but it contains a grain of truth. And that's a thought that nobody's ever had before, and the whole of his philosophy of mathematics is working out the idea that mathematics is normative, mathematics is a human creation, not an insight into eternal truths in a Platonic heaven. And there can be alternative mathematics. So the whole of his work is exploring and exploiting this insight. The third domain, about which I do want to say a few words in a moment, is in philosophy of psychology. In philosophy of psychology, he undermined the dualist conception that we find in Descartes and Cartesian follows, also in John Locke. Equally undermined the mentalist conception that you find, say, in David Hume, Bishop Berkeley. So he thought both mentalism and dualism were misguided. He thought reductionism, or physicalism as it's sometimes called, namely saying, the mind is the brain, that is completely misguided. And he plows up the field de novo to produce a vision of the nature of the mind that has very... in one way it's unparalleled, in another way it reaches over 2,400 years to Aristotle, because it does, at a very, very general level, have similarities to the Aristotelian vision. And the last area, which in a way is the most dramatic, but you can't understand it unless you understand his work in the other domains, he revolutionized the nature of philosophy. All philosophers thought that philosophy was a pursuit of human knowledge, would add to human knowledge about humanity and about the world we live in, and that it was a quest for truths about the world. And Wittgenstein, very interesting, raised a question, is it really like that? If you go to a physicist and say, look, you've been doing physics at least, let us say, for 400 years, if not much more, but let's say 400 years, what have you got to show for it? He says, look, you see that building over there? It's full of books, and it's full of books which tell you the truths and theories that we've confirmed, discovered and confirmed. Vast amount of knowledge, and that's surely true. You go to a chemist, you say, what have you done in the last 300 years? And the chemist will do the same. There will be endless books about all the materials that have been analyzed or synthesized, and so on and so forth. Go to the philosopher and say, right, you've been in business for 2,500 years. What have you got to show about it? Truths that are established, incontestable, absolutely solid truths. And the answer is nothing at all. Not a thing. Well, how can that be? After all, some of the greatest minds in Western civilization have dedicated their lives to philosophy, and they've done nothing? They've produced not a single truth? And the answer is, yeah, in a sense, yes, that's right. Now, is that because philosophy is so fiendishly difficult? It's more difficult than microphysics, it's more difficult than cosmology? Come off it. So there's a real question here. And he thought that the answer was, you've misunderstood the nature of the subject. First of all, philosophy is not a contribution to human knowledge. You won't learn anything worth learning about the world by studying philosophy. You want to know, how do we know that the external world exists? Well, how do we know that there's a microphone here? By looking and touching. Is that news? How do you know that so-and-so is angry? Well, he's gone red in the face and is thumping on the table. Big deal. I mean, if that's the sort of knowledge that philosophy is going to produce, we can do without it. And he says, rightly, these kinds of answers just making fun of the questions. Because the task of philosophy is to clear away the confusions that stand in the way of accepting these platitudes for what they are. There are endless arguments that show you can't be certain about any empirical proposition concerning the so-called external world, namely all the skeptical arguments in them. Okay, the task of philosophy is to show that all those arguments are misconceived in one way or another. There are endless stories about, can we know about so-called other minds? And you go to contemporary psychologists and they will tell you, each little child has to construct a theory of mind. And poor autistic children are autistic because they don't have a theory of mind. You know, when they develop a theory of mind, then they can judge somebody's angry or joyous. And you might say, well, really? I mean, I don't have a theory of mind. How can this little 3-year-old child have a theory of mind? Something is wrong with the thought. One can say, how do I know he's angry? Because he's gone red in the face and is shouting back because he was insulted. So there are endless considerations which almost force us down these wrong pathways into confusion and error and misconception. And the task of philosophy is to show that they're wrong for a whole multitude of reasons. He had a wonderful... So, philosophy is not a quest for knowledge, it's a quest for understanding. Understanding of what? Understanding of our conceptual scheme and the way it hangs together. The network of concepts we employ in our everyday thought and language hang together by logical connections of certain sorts. I mean, if something is red, then it's coloured. If something's red all over, it can't be green all over at the same time. If something is red, then it's more like something orange than it is like something yellow. These are necessary truths. These are structural truths. So if you've got 3 cushions, one is red, one is orange, one is yellow, you can say without looking that the first is more like the second colour-wise than it is like the third. That's what red is more like orange than it is like yellow amounts to. Whereas the metaphysician will say these are eternal necessities built into the structure of reality, true in all possible worlds. It's nonsense, right? These are just rules of representation. So, philosophy is a contribution to human understanding, not a contribution to human knowledge. And the task of philosophy is to clarify conceptual confusions and to give a surveyable picture of some domain of our language with all its logical interconnections, compatibilities, incompatibilities, implications, and so forth. Okay, you might say, and this is where I'll stop this preliminary survey, that he's pursuing an extremely deep and interesting heuristic principle. Namely, when you find 2 positions in philosophy, say realism and idealism, where philosophers have been quarrelling for centuries, then your natural instinct is to say, okay, let's sit down like good students and read everything said about realism, read everything said about idealism, look at the arguments in great detail and decide where the balance of argument lies. And he says, no, don't do that. That's a waste of time. If that was the thing to do, that would have been solved hundreds and hundreds of years ago. No, what you need to look for is what do both sides agree upon and challenge that. Because very often what they agree upon, they don't even notice. It's too close to them, so to speak. It's like the glasses on your nose. You can't see it. But if you can pin down the common agreement which is generating the conflict and challenge that, then you may show that both sides are completely misconceived, and you can pursue a further alternative of showing what went wrong. And I think that's a very, very profound principle. It's just it needs genius to make use of it. And it's a genius that he certainly possessed. Okay. Now, I want to say a little about his philosophy of language. If you look at philosophy of language of the past century and more, philosophers and linguists divide a huge school, the dominant school, looks upon language as a calculus of meaning. Now, this comes from logicians who will view philosophy of language as having an underlying depth grammar or structure of the predicate calculus, a particular pattern of modern logic. If you go to Chomsky and his school, again, you have a powerful theory which advances the thought that the underlying principles of grammar are deeply embedded in what he calls, or is pleased to call, the mind-brain, and And there you have a whole set of rules, you have a set of definitions, you have a set of formation and transformation rules, and the brain turns the crank and out come meaningful sentences. And the task of the linguist is to discover this hidden underlying structure of a calculus. It's a mechanical calculus where if you feed in the right principles and definitions, it will feed form sentences with a meaning. Now that's dominated 20th century thought and continues to do so, certainly in this university. Now, Wittgenstein had agreed with that when he wrote the Tractatus, roughly speaking. But when he wrote the later work, he came to see this as completely misconceived. You should look upon language as a human practice, a human activity. What it is to have mastered a language is not to manipulate a calculus subconsciously or unconsciously. It's to engage in activities. It's to do things with words. What the child learns when it learns to speak is not how to operate a calculus, but how to ask for something, how to demand something, how to resist something, say no, and so on and so forth. And you must look upon language as a motley of what he called language games. What he meant by a language game was a particular pattern of usage of words which are embedded in a multitude of activities, right? So they take place against a standard background, a context. You rip them out of that context and they just fall apart. Just like, say, tennis, where tennis is played on this earth with a gravitational force of 1g. Take it to the moon, well, I guess you can play, but it's a bit pointless because the server is going to win every single game. So it becomes pointless. But it's not part of the rules of tennis that it's played in a world with a gravitational force of 1g. Right? So we play the language games we play against a stable background of a certain kind. If you destabilize that background, then these linguistic practices will fall apart. So look upon language as like a biological or an anthropological phenomenon, not as a quasi-mathematical or logical phenomenon. That's extremely important. Now, in addition to that, he insisted that language doesn't have an essence. He was, in his later work, a passionate anti-essentialist. That is, some concepts are defined by a set of essential conditions, necessary and sufficient conditions for the application of the word. And some are. I mean, a bachelor is an unmarried man, and a circle is a point equidistant, a set of points equidistant from a given point, and so on. So some concepts are defined by necessary and sufficient conditions, but very few. It shouldn't be a presupposition. Now, Plato, who was always in quest of definitions, handed down to us a tradition of looking for definitions. And Wittgenstein said, well, for most interesting concepts, there aren't any definitions. You explain them by means of a set of examples and a similarity rider, or you explain them by reference to different sets of paradigms which are interrelated in very complicated, complex ways. Now, he didn't think, when he wrote the Tractatus, he thought that language had an essence, and he said what it was. And you might say the calculus theorist will say, well, a language is a set of sentences, meaningful sentences with a sense, that can be generated by these set of transformation principles and fundamental set of definitions. And that's a language. The totality of sentences that can be ground out from the language machine, so to speak. And Wittgenstein said, what is a language? Well, it's things like English, German, Chinese, Japanese, and other things like that. And that's about as much as you could say at that level of generality. And there is no one essential feature or set of essential features characterizing language. He challenged a couple of very fundamental principles. In fact, he opens the investigations with this, namely the thought that words stand for things, and sentences are made up of words, and the role of sentences is to describe how things are. That's the most natural way to think about language. Almost all of us unthinkingly will so conceive of language, and it's a thread running through philosophy from Plato down to the present day. And he thought it was completely wrong, completely misguided, not false, but a misleading, deeply misleading picture which lead you into deep, deep confusions. To say that the role of words is to stand for things, well, you might say that the word glass stands for things like this. What about the word and, or however, and perhaps, and so on for a multitude of intention, or fear, hope, and love. Do they stand for things? No, don't raise the question of what they stand for. That'll lead you up the garden path. Look at how you use them. What sort of structures do they fulfill in sentences, and what purpose is fulfilled by their employment in a sentence? Look at how you explain them. So, for example, the meaning of the word is not the thing that it stands for, as was often thought, but rather the meaning of a word isn't a thing of any kind. What you should ask for is the use of the word, because the meaning of the word, for most uses of the phrase meaning of a word, is the use of the word. And in most contexts where we talk about the meaning of a word, we can replace the phrase the meaning of a word by the use of the word. Instead of asking what does that word mean, you can ask how is that word used. Now, equally interestingly, you can say that the meaning of a word is what is given by an explanation of its meaning. I mean, you asked me what a glass is, and I said it's a receptacle like this for holding liquids. That's a perfectly decent explanation. Not an explanation, as it were, giving a set of necessary and sufficient conditions, but it's an explanation that is sufficient to enable you to go on and use the word glass. And that's all that's needed. The thought that in explaining the meaning of a word, or explaining what a word means, we have to lay down a set of conditions that, as it were, will specify all possible uses of the word is a complete fantasy. Because, first of all, there's no limited set of things that are called all possible uses. It's open. Who knows what great poets will come along and use the word glass in a slightly different way, and so on and so forth. We explain the meaning of a word when there's something misunderstood, where somebody doesn't know how to use it, doesn't know how to go on with it, and then you give an explanation which is successful if he then goes on correctly. So the meaning of a word is its use, the meaning of a word is given by an explanation of meaning. You can say also the meaning of a word is its place in grammar, what category it belongs to. So you specify, if you're talking about colour words like red or peach blossom pink or blue, well, these are colour words. And to say it's a colour word is to give its place in grammar, because then you know, if it's a colour word, it can be predicated of visible objects, not of sounds. I mean, sounds can't be red, green or blue, but a surface can be red, green or blue. And so on and so forth. Now, equally, he adds, the meaning of a word is what we understand when we know what it means. So the meaning of a word is the object of understanding. Equally importantly, understanding, contrary to everything that Chomsky says, is not a mental state, but a very complex ability. It's the ability to do things with words, and an ability to react to what other people do with words. Okay. And finally, explanations of meaning are in effect rules for the use of a word. Explanations are themselves normative. They are rules. They tell you how to use the word correctly. Okay, now, there's a great deal more to be said here, but he steers the philosophy of language down, broadly speaking, ethnological or anthropological lines to view language not as a calculus that can be embedded in the mind-brain, but as a human activity, learnt in a human community, learnt in interaction with other human beings. Now, in my view, this insight, and this is just a fragment which I've given you, this insight undermines most of contemporary philosophy of language and most of contemporary theoretical linguistics. Certainly everything said by Chomsky and his followers and his schools, right, where they talk about rules of language and definitions being embedded in the mind brain. Now, first of all, there's no such thing as a mind brain any more than there's such a thing as a sight eye. I mean, do you have a sight eye? It's patent rubbish. Right? You can talk about the mind, you can talk about the brain, you can't talk about the mind brain. Now, you can't embed rules in brains, you can embed axes in brains, right? But not a set of rules. Rules aren't the sorts of things you can embed in brains, nor can you embed definitions or word meanings. Now, they just published a couple of weeks ago on the front page of Nature some neuroscientists finding out exactly where, I don't know, 1,000 words, exactly where they're located in the cortex. I think very interesting, located, you can locate, well, is it written down there? No. So what is it? Well, when you poke it, you poke the brain here, then you forget what the word means. Why didn't you say that? That may be true for all we know. At least it makes sense. But that doesn't mean that words are stored there. You can store words in diaries and dictionaries. That's where you store words, not in brains. Okay. So much. I won't say more about the philosophy of language. I want to say something about his philosophy of psychology, which I think is an amazing achievement. First of all, what was he rejecting? Well, he was rejecting a long tradition, again dating back to the Greeks, which he referred to as the inner-outer picture of the mind. And that is a conception of the mental as it were, as a world that is hidden behind behavior. So the picture is that when you see me, all you see is a body behaving in certain ways, but you can't see my mind, can you? No. So who can see my mind? Well, only I can see my mind. So this world of the mental is accessible to the subject. And that's often said to be that the subject has privileged access to the mind. And how does he do that? Well, by introspection, of course, because what is introspection? Well, it's peering inside yourself and seeing what's there. That's almost a quotation from William James. You look inside and see what's there. And what's there, of course, is something you own. I mean, you can see there your pains and your aches and your pleasures and your joys and your fears and your hopes, your intentions and so on. And how do you do it? Well, by the inner sense. You have an outer sense, or 5 outer senses, and you have inner senses to perceive what's inside your mind. Well, then the question becomes, what's the relationship between this bare bodily behavior and what's going on in the mind? And that is the question which has exercised philosophers for 2,500 years, and exercised psychologists since the beginning of psychology in the 19th century, and continues to do so. And Wittgenstein thought the whole picture is misconceived. It's misconceived from top to bottom and from left to right. I mean, everything is wrong about it. It's not silly. None of these deep philosophical fallacies are silly. Right? They are traps which language lays for us. And we fall into those traps. And it's very, very difficult to resist. So what does he replace this picture of the inner and the outer? Well, I've mentioned the fact that he advances a conception of human beings as language-using animals. Everything that makes us human is a corollary or a consequence of our mastery of a language. Now just think we're mammals, we're anthropoid apes. What distinguishes us from other animals? Well, we speak a language, no other animal does. We have, I dare to say, knowledge of good and evil. No other animal does. We have a capacity for self-consciousness. No other animal does. What else can I say? We can engage in abstract reasoning, namely in mathematics, and know truths of reason, truths of logic and mathematics. No other animal does. What else can we cite? We have a sense of history, and we are historical creatures. Our history, fictional or mythological or actual, is part of our own identity. Other animals don't have biographies or autobiographies. They have lives, but not biographies or autobiographies. Now, all these features, in Wittgenstein's view, presuppose possession of a language. Only creatures who are language users can do the things that we do. And that is what makes us human. Now, one immediate corollary of this is that this sheds light on the nature of thought, because since Plato and Aristotle, philosophers have racked their brains, what is the relationship between thought and language? Now, the received view is thought is antecedent to language, and you can think whatever you wish to think, and then if you wish to communicate the thought to others, then you need a language. So language is needed for the communication of thought. But thought in and of itself, as it were, is completely independent of language. And Wittgenstein argues at great length, with immense subtlety, that's completely wrong. And the general principle that can be extracted from what he says is the following. The limits of thought, what one can think, not what one does think, but what one can think, what a creature can think, are the limits of the possible expression of thought that is in the behavioral repertoire of the animal. It only makes sense to ascribe a thought to a being if there is something that being can do which would express that thought. Now, in that sense, you can say, well, animals can think very, very primitive things. So I go to the fridge to get out the dog food, and the dog jumps to its feet, wags its tail, rushes to its plate. It thinks I'm going to feed it. How can you say that? Well, look, it's overjoyed. It wags its tail. It rushes to the plate where it's always fed. This is behavior that expresses the fact that it thinks it's to be fed. Just as, when its master, the master comes home, the dog's master comes home, footsteps on the pavement outside, the dog jumps to its feet, barks joyously, right? You say it thinks its master's about to come in. How can you say that? Well, look at its behavior. That behavior expresses its so thinking. That is, that's how we would describe the behavior. But what about the dog thinking that its master will come home tomorrow at 2:30? There is nothing in the behavioral repertoire of a dog that could express that thought. Right? So the limits of thought are the limits of the behavior that would express it. Now, the vast range of the thoughts we have and the things we can think only have an expression in words, in language. Right? You need in order to think general thoughts that, all dogs are lovely or horrible, as the case may be, you have to have expressions of generality. How on earth could a dog think, what would it be for a dog to think that all dogs have a good smell? Right? What's it supposed to do? It can't say anything, and there's no way in which it behaves which would warrant ascribing that thought to the dog. Right? We can think about the past and the future, but no animal can, because they don't possess temporal concepts, because they don't have words which refer to particular times in the past or in the future. So this insight, I think, is extremely deep, extremely and altogether original, and I think it is also correct. Now let's turn to the notion of the mind. We're torn, or throughout history we've been torn between the thought, well, the mind is a spiritual substance that happens to be associated with the body. And this goes back a very long time, certainly embedded in Plato. Interestingly enough, there's hardly anything about it in the Old Testament. It's a later importation, if I'm not much mistaken, from the Babylonian exile, and there's even then not a great deal of trace until much later. But you find it in Plato, not in Aristotle. And it's a pervasive thought. Christianity seized hold of it, and it's a dominant element in Christian thought. Descartes puts it right at the center of his philosophy. A human being is a composite being with a mind and a body that are, for the time being, conjoined, and they interact causally at the point of the pineal gland. So the mind is a spiritual substance, an immaterial substance. That's one view. A different view is that the mind is the brain. That's a much more recent view, but very, very popular today. Yet another view would be to say, well, really, strictly speaking, the mind is just a set of actual and possible behaviors, behaviorism. And Wittgenstein thought this was all wrong. And part of the difficulty is the form of the question. What is the mind? What is a so-and-so demands the question, a so-and-so is a. And what if the question isn't amenable to that kind of treatment? Right? And this is one obvious case. don't ask what is a mind and then search for a mind is something, and then you think, well, it's a very mysterious something. Ask, what is it for a creature to have a mind? What has to be true of an animal, of a being, creature, for us to ascribe a mind and mental attributes to that being? And roughly speaking, to have a mind is to have a distinctive set of capacities, a set of capacities characteristic of language-using creatures, abilities to do certain kinds of things. Right? So having aches and pains doesn't betoken having a mind. Dogs have aches and pains too. Not even getting angry or being frightened, but being able to recognize reasons for action, being able to reason from premises, which are reasons, to conclusions, being able to think. These are features of a creature with a mind. So it's far better to develop the thought, which he does in great detail, that when we're talking about the mind, we're talking about the distinctive capacities of a language-using being, such as self-consciousness, rationality, capacity for reason and acting for reasons, and so forth. Now, the standard view about the mind was we know about what's in the mind by introspection. But introspection isn't, I mean, we're misled by this trivial etymology. To introspect isn't to look into anything, it's to think about something, right? Somebody who is given to introspection, like Marcel Proust, thinks about himself all the time, thinks about his motivations, wonders why he did such and such, and was it really for this reason or was it for some other reason? Right? An introspective person is somebody who thinks about his own motivation, his own reasons, his own projects, and so forth, more than most people do, as Marcel Proust did. It's not a form of inner vision. Now, of course, if you have a headache, you can say so. And if you want a glass of water, you can ask for one. Or you can go and get yourself one. And if you're frightened of tomorrow's examination, you can, I don't know, have a gin and tonic or something. You can say how things are with you, but the capacity to say how things are with you doesn't rest on anything. You just say so. How can this be? Well, look, here he draws a set of little pictures. We master the use of the word pain. How do we do that? Well, a little child hurts itself and it cries. And Mummy rushes to calm it down. No, does it hurt? Do you have a pain, little Tommy? Or etc., etc. So gradually the child will learn to say, ow. Or if it's in Germany, aya. Right? And in due course hurts. And maybe in the fullness of time, Mummy, I have a headache. Now these begins as expressions of pain. They're natural. The behavior is the root natural expression of screaming, crying, assuaging the injured part. Onto this natural behavior, you grasp linguistic behavior. So you graft linguistic behavior. And that linguistic behavior then grows, getting more and more complex. So you want to look upon your ability to say it hurts or I have a headache as a sophisticated form of pain behavior, an acculturated form of pain behavior. Now, you don't ask of the you say, how do I know that I have a pain? Or how does the child know to scream? It doesn't know to scream, it just screams, right? Get rid of the idea that there's an intervening step of knowing something, or of being ignorant of something. It's not that you don't know, it's the question of either knowing or not knowing is neither here nor there. It's a form of natural behavior. You learn to use sensory predicates, see, hear, smell, taste, feel. Well, first of all, you learn to say, it's white, or it's blue, or that's red. How do you know? Well, I saw it. So Mummy says to the little child, this is red. Can you see? This is red. So you learn to operate with the verb to see on the visual predicate, on the predicate of a visual quality, like being red or being square, and so on and so forth. What about intending? Because again, it's very puzzling. I can tell you what I intend to do, and I intend to go home after this meeting, and so forth and so on. How on earth do I know what I intend? You're looking at it wrongly. So look at the roots of the language game. Well, what are they? So he suggests very nicely. So think of the parent playing with a child and playing ball. So I'm going to throw you the ball, Tommy. Catch, here. So you learn to use I'm going to as heralding an action. And when you say I'm going to, it's part of the game that you go on to. Otherwise you've misused it, and the parents will correct you. So look upon expressions of intention as having their roots in heralding an action, and part of the language game is when you've said I intend, you go on to do, or you say I'm going to, you go on to do. Now, that's the root. Out of this root grows a vast tree of ever greater complexity, but that's how it begins. It doesn't begin with knowledge of any kind, right? And so on. Okay. Now, in addition to that, informed of one other, yes, I must stop. One other point here, and again, it's a deep one. Throughout the history of philosophy, and for anybody who struggles with philosophy, particularly philosophy of psychology, there's an overwhelming temptation to start with the first-person case. And how do I know that I'm in pain? Not with how do I know that you're in pain? And how do I know that you're in pain? Well, you just cut yourself and you're screaming. That's how you, right? But after all, I don't have to look to see whether I've cut myself to be able to say I'm in pain. So how do I know? So we're terribly tempted to concentrate on the first-person case. Partly because there's an apparent mystery. An apparent mystery. There are no mysteries in philosophy. Mysteries are mystifications. Right? There are no mysteries, but you get the appearance of a mystery because you think, well, look, I can say what I see, I can say what I hear, I can say what I perceive, I can say what sensations I have, I can say what I plan to do, what I intend to do, what my motive, without any evidence. I mean, I don't have to look at my behavior to say these things. And here you're Wittgenstein telling me, I think I do this on the basis of introspection. I peer into myself, but here you're Wittgenstein saying, no, you don't do that, you just say so. What do you mean, I just say so? Very puzzling, because it looked, and notice one more thing, which was centre of Descartes' thought. Can I be wrong? I mean, I tell you, I've got a splitting headache. You say, no, you don't. You just want a cup of coffee. So, go away, I want an aspirin, not a cup of coffee. So, could I be wrong? Could I mistake a pain for intending to go to London? What rubbish, right? So this is very mysterious. I don't go wrong. Nor can I doubt. I mean, can I say, well, I think I've got a pain, maybe I've got a pain, maybe not, I'll find out. Well, that doesn't wash. This is getting more and more mysterious, because it looks as if I am, with respect to the contents of my mind, like God. I mean, I can never make a mistake, and if I say it so, it is so. We get stranger and stranger. And more misleading, of course. Now, what he did was to shift the weight of the investigation onto the third-person case. That is, in order to have mastered the concept of pain, you have to realize that when people damage their body in certain ways and cry out or scream or weep or assuage the injury or groan, then you say they've hurt themselves. And you have to realize that when somebody hurts themselves, that's a reason for commiseration, of reacting in certain ways. You don't break out into shrieks of laughter if somebody's hurt themselves. If you've mastered that, then you may also use the word pain as an expression of pain. And you will be said to have mastered the use of the word pain, to have grasped the concept of pain, when you've mastered both the first-person case and the third-person case. These are two sides of one coin. You can't separate the one from the other. On the traditional view, you master the use of the word pain in your own case, and then you look around to see, well, does this word apply to other creatures? I mean, so you've got it absolutely upside down, right? You can't separate the capacity to apply psychological predicates to yourself without grounds from your grasp of the kinds of grounds on the basis of which you ascribe those predicates to other people too. So these are locked, interlocked, and they're part of the criteria, part of the grounds on which we say he knows what this word means. He knows what the word joy means, or what the word fear means, and so on. The traditional view is only if you've had a pain can you know what the word pain means. Only if you've been jealous can you know what the word jealousy means, and so on and so forth, which is quite wrong. I mean, after all, you can read Swann's Way, all about jealousy, even though you've never been jealous. We understand it perfectly well. Right? And, I mean, men have the fortune of not having to suffer the pangs of childbirth, but does that mean they don't know perfectly well that their wife is giving birth to a child is in terrible pain? It's excruciatingly painful, agonizing. Of course they do. Now you say, but they don't know what it's really like. You mean they haven't had the pain? Well, that's true. But to have a pain isn't to know what it's like. What is pain like? Dreadful. So you do know what it's like. So don't confuse not having experienced whatever it is in question and not knowing what it is to experience it. Right? After all, it's perfectly true that the ability to describe is not a substitute for having the experience. I can describe the beauties of the Sistine Chapel to you until the cows come home, but you still won't have seen it. A description isn't a substitute for seeing. Well, of course not. Who should express it? Who should expect it to be? I mean, I can describe a cup of coffee to you, but that won't quench your thirst. Right? So there's a really very fundamental reorientation of philosophy of psychology, reorientation of a conception of the mind and of the conception of the mental. And that is one of the great achievements. Now, I want to say one last word about the nature of philosophy. In his view, for reasons which I've already explained, the task of philosophy is to unravel conceptual confusions. Conceptual confusions are deeply rooted, pretty much, not completely, but often perennial. They will recur again and again and again. Its contribution is to understanding, not an addition to human knowledge. It doesn't add to the fund of knowledge about the world. If it involves knowledge at all, it's just a knowledge of our conceptual scheme, which is something we all operate with anyway. So its task is, in one sense, destructive and therapeutic. It dissolves problems. But, of course, that also involves describing part of the structure. And Wittgenstein compares his activities with logical geography. He says, I'm trying to give you the map of the city so that you'll be able to find your way around by yourself when you confront new problems. And in order to do so, he spells out, for many, many concepts and types of concepts, the salient logical connections. Right? Now, one corollary of this is, because it's a contribution to human understanding, not to human knowledge, you can't transmit philosophy from one generation to another in the sense in which you can transmit science from one generation to another. I can teach you physics till the cows come home and you can learn it. And then you will know that part of physics. But in the case of philosophy, I'm concerned with understanding. Now, I can't give you my understanding. I can help you understand for yourself, but you have to do it yourself. To use the American phrase, each person has to roll his own. And the same problems will keep cropping up generation after generation after generation because the roots of the confusion are embedded in our language or arise out of new analogies. I mean, Aristotle didn't have to struggle over the question of whether the mind is like a computer or not like a computer, whether the brain is a computer or not. There weren't any computers. Plato didn't have to struggle with the question of how does natural language stand to the predicate calculus. There wasn't any predicate calculus. So with new inventions, new technologies, new intellectual advances, new problems come upon the carpet. But the old problems are still there, and each generation has to win its way through into the light, so to speak. One can help them, but one can't do it for them. Thank you very much.